Great. Thank you, Kevin, for the introduction. My role today is to talk a little bit about what's happening in New York regarding the cannabis industry. Cannabis isn't new to New York. New York has had a fairly, limited medical marijuana program for a number of years now, where the industry was limited to an extremely few number of participants that were allowed to sell medical marijuana for very limited medical purposes. And so the industry has been kind of coming into play for a number of years now, with manufacturers and retailers really looking to grow and develop that beyond just a limited capacity. Has been a very aggressive push with the New York governor's office and the legislature to expand it. And as everyone is probably aware at this point, in April of this year, New York passed the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, and the act accomplished a couple of things that's really going to impact everyone across the board. The first and the most obvious and the most headline-driven piece of the legislation is that marijuana is now legal for recreational use, right? And so everyone across New York is permitted to use marijuana, in most scenarios, and we'll talk about what is still restricted. But what's more important to businesses in New York is that the recreational use will significantly impact HR and workforce policies and procedures, right? Because now this is another component that businesses need to be thinking about, be considerate of. The other piece is essentially the initial and beginning framework of essentially a brand new industry, from starting at the most basic level, which is growth cultivation, all the way through retail and online sales. And so there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of things being happening right now in anticipation of this industry. Now, one thing that we don't know right now, and this will be sort of a repetitive theme here, is we are at the infancy here, right? And so we don't know a lot of things yet. The regulations for how the various industries will be managed, will be overseen, all that is in process. All we know is that here's the framework for the industry, and now the new Office of Cannabis Control Board and the Office of Cannabis Management will be responsible over the next year to 18 months to really create the framework, so that anyone interested in expanding and growing into this industry, getting involved at different levels, would have an understanding of what it is that they need to do, how to get involved, what compliance requirements are, and all that. So a big chunk of that is still not available, and so we wait on those regulations while at the same time plan and prepare for it. So jumping in, kind of give a little bit of detail as to what's legal right now. Adults over 21 can possess up to 3 ounces of cannabis and 24 grams of concentrated cannabis. That is what's legal immediately as of April of this year. And anyone in New York State is able to avail themselves of of these new regulations. So for anyone here, who's got employees and who have, the employees are now allowed to do this legally, right? And whether or not they were doing it before and how it impacts work, that's one thing. That the point is now, it's a protected right, so to speak. There's certain limits to that. Obviously, driving under the influence is still prohibited. Operating motor vehicles is still prohibited. Anywhere where smoking tobacco is prohibited, that remains a prohibition on cannabis as well. And so the key issue for a lot of the businesses that we see is, how does it impact our workforce, right? And so the thing that's been driving our involvement and our support of the businesses we work with today, and is really helping navigate how to update policies, how to deal with employees and issues that are going to inevitably come up now that, this is sort of now out in the open, right? So, again, cannabis is not new to the world. The percentages are, pretty staggering as far as the amount of people across the state that have, historically used cannabis, except now it is open. And so what do we need to do as employers, and how do we advise employers to, to really address the issues that are relevant? So the thing to keep in mind is that it is now protected activity, right? So employers may not make employment decisions based on employee use of cannabis, right? And again, it's not a broad, unrestricted right. It's limited where cannabis use is not allowed on duty. So that's still something that protects our businesses. And also any use has to be off premises and not using any property or equipment of the employer. And so this was part of a change in labor law specifically addressing this issue. And the other critical component here is when deciding whether to hire someone, or anyone that's hired, when finding out that someone has had a past marijuana related conviction, that may not be taken into account when making an employment decision. Now, many businesses do background checks, and depending on the business and what the specific job is, it's important to continue to do background checks, to do drug tests, and to do all the things that many businesses have done over the years. Except now there's this other component, another consideration that we have to think about. And anyone who's making hiring decisions, would probably know about how to address past criminal convictions in making those decisions, where when finding out about a conviction and making a decision based on it, there are certain criteria that employers generally have had to think about and evaluate. Now, marijuana convictions specifically cannot be a reason for not hiring someone. However, there are certain, to this point, identified criteria where marijuana use and convictions can be used as a decision in making, regarding an employee. The first one is when obviously when the law prohibits or requires that no marijuana use. And the best example I could give of this is, there's certain, warehouse operators, certain licensed drivers, delivery personnel that have certain special licenses where drug use may not be permitted, heavy equipment operators. There are a lot of laws, and all of those remain intact. And so anyone who's involved in that type of work, nothing changes for them, right? Those people are still subject to the same restrictions that they've always had in place. And so there's not a whole lot of concern there. So that's still allowed. Marijuana is still marijuana use is still something that could be considered in those scenarios. The other scenario is where it affects the job itself, right? So if you have for example, on a construction site, you have a flag person, right, who's responsible for being alert and aware of what's happening. That's a position potentially where we could say, you are not allowed to use marijuana or use cannabis, where it would impact your job and worker safety. And so that's taken into account. And just to be clear, again, and to reiterate, the point and the issue here is, on the job use is still prohibited. It's what a person does off the job. And the best way to think about it is, it's equatable to alcohol use, right? Many employees, typically go home, have a drink after work, and no one ever bats an eye or ever says anything. Marijuana and cannabis use is really being put in the same category, right? So usage at home is okay, usage on the job is not. and usage at home is also not okay in certain job criteria. And then the third enumerated item where employers can prohibit cannabis use is if it will impact any sort of contract, right? So, especially contracts relating with the government, whether it's state or federal, and so in those scenarios, we are still, as employers allowed to, put prohibitions in place. So the issue with internal policies, right? And before this, many employers have had broad policies and broad restrictions against drug use in the workforce. In some cases, folks have policies that prohibit drug use outside the workforce. That may need to be addressed now. Things like carving out cannabis use, maybe something that some policies would need to be addressed. As far as folks that drug test employees, especially in the scenario of an incident or any occurrence, aside from insurance restrictions, the process for addressing an incident now is, or identifying an employee who is intoxicated on the job is now, a little different. There is no impairment test for cannabis. It does not exist. There are companies that have been developing this, and then what I'm talking about specifically is identifying whether a person is impaired at the moment that they are being tested. And this is a key difference between alcohol in the workforce, where blood alcohol content test can tell with immediacy whether a person is intoxicated or not and how intoxicated they are. For cannabis, this doesn't exist, and many states that have legalized recreational marijuana use have struggled with this issue, and so have many employers because, again, the typical scenario is that an incident occurs. Sometimes policies mandate that a person involved in an incident gets immediately tested for impairment, and with cannabis, the test will not be clear as to whether or not the person is impaired at the moment or whether they were impaired 2 days ago. The tests that do exist show that the person may have been impaired at some point, but there's no testing available today. So what companies have been doing, and now is probably a good time to sort of reevaluate and rethink how the policies are structured, is to create what's called a reasonable suspicion test, right? Where if an employee presents certain symptoms indicative of cannabis impairment, that has been identified as sufficient to determine whether or not a person is impaired. Now, is it a perfect test? Is it absolutely objective every time? It's not. And so what we advise our clients and companies that we work with is to, create framework that would be as objective as possible, right? And so identify criteria that identifies impairment. So things like delayed reaction, bloodshot or watery eyes, sleepiness, and have more than one person potentially be involved in evaluating an employee, especially one involved in an incident, about their potential level of impairment. And part of the process is keeping strong documentation, because again, what would typically happen is if an employee is deemed to be impaired, especially at work, or especially more so when the employee is involved in an incident, those things are subject to reprimand, termination, and depending on the severity of the issue. And so the framework, the legal framework, is that employers are not allowed to discriminate against folks that are lawfully using cannabis at home. And so when making a determination based on this, keeping clear and accurate records on this issue is an important part of it, and making sure that our businesses are prepared to evaluate such a scenario, because again, this is something that you never think you need to deal with it until you need to deal with it. And so being prepared and having a plan in place for addressing this is sort of a key thing right now, as it will certainly be a bigger issue over time as the cannabis industry continues to grow and expand in New York. So to kind of shift from the employment process, I'm going to speak a little bit about what is going to be available for businesses out there, right? Especially ones that see opportunity to get into the cannabis industry at different levels, right? So, the key thing that was authorized as of April of this year is personal use. What hasn't been authorized is essentially everything else, right? Which is the industry of sale, right? So we're sort of in this gray unknown area right now where individuals can use cannabis, but they can't legally buy it anywhere. And so it creates a bit of a paradox in and of itself, but that's where we are. And so while we wait for the regulations on the different licensing and industry permissions, we have some idea of what it will look like, right? So obviously there's going to be some at home for personal use cultivation that would be permitted. Again, that's not permitted yet. That will be in effect, and the regulations for that will come over time. And so again, we wait on the regulations, but beyond personal use is industry. And this is just some information again for personal use that's been identified to this point, but we wait on beyond as to how businesses will be affected, right? One thing to note is that the law does allow municipalities, and this now relates to retail distribution. So essentially what we're talking about are cannabis cafes that would be potentially authorized under the new cannabis legislation, is that local municipalities have the ability to pass local laws to opt out of allowing cannabis retail in their jurisdiction. And the deadline for doing so is December of this year. So there's been some buzz about, what parts of Long Island will look to opt out. And the decision is really being driven twofold, right? One is the moral aspect, right, where some have identified the issue as morally unacceptable, and so some municipalities are going to be making decisions based on that. The other component, of course, is the business side of it, right? And with retail cannabis operations, there will be significant taxes that will be that will be passed through to each municipality in the range of I believe about 3% of sales will be allocated to the municipalities and where the businesses are located. And so some are making decisions saying, hey, look, we need the revenue, we need the tax revenue for our business, and we're okay with cannabis being sold at retail in our in our town. Others have said no way, and so identified a few that have publicly spoken up about it. Now realistically, I don't believe from what I've seen where anyone's actually passed any sort of legislation to opt out. So there's a lot of talk for now. We'll have to, this is also one of those wait and see things where we'll have to see how it plays out and where it goes, and whether some of these towns that have already said they're interested in opting out, whether they're actually going to do it. Town of Riverhead, in the last few weeks has said that they will not be opting out, right? That they, that's sort of where they are headed. Others have said otherwise. And so, in addition to opting out, municipalities are allowed to also past certain restrictions, and what those will look like, again, we'll also have to wait and see. So now to talk a little bit about licensing, right? So there are several different licensing available from cultivator, which is a business that would grow plants, all the way through to retail, which is a business that will publicly sell to the end user, right? In this case, the end user being all of us here who wish to be involved and use cannabis. So there will be a limit on licensing, right? And so the big unknown right now, the big black hole of information for us is how many licenses will be available, how will businesses get in line, how will they be get priority, right? Because anyone who wants to be involved in the industry is going to want to be as close to first in line as possible. And so one thing that has been identified is that there will be a social equity component, right? Where it's unclear whether the social equity component will apply to all the licenses or just to some, possibly just to micro business, possibly just to retail. But 50% of the licenses are intended to be allocated towards certain, minority women-owned groups, distressed folks, disabled veterans, and the impacted by cannabis prohibition is really intended to target and support folks that have had marijuana-related convictions in the past that will now be allowed to have priority seating towards getting licensed in the industry. There will also be, for this group, counseling and business advisory services, as well as extremely discounted capital to get their business going. So to kind of touch on what the licenses are and what they what they are to be used for, and there's information where businesses may not hold a bunch of different licenses. So for example, if you are a cultivator, you may not also be a retailer. And so the intent there is to be able to separate and independently create businesses and industries to grow that way, and really to allow more open access to the different industries that folks want to get involved in. So a cultivator license will allow businesses to harvest plants, and essentially, it's the grower license, right? Where it's for businesses that want to grow and cultivate, right? So farmers and businesses like that. A nursery license is intended for businesses that want to create the products that will be ultimately cultivated. So things like seeding, things like supply, and all the items and equipment that will be necessary for that will come to businesses that are obtain a nursery license. A processor license is intended for businesses that are that would be extracting concentrated cannabis, right? So these are for the various oil products and all the different other things that can be processed chemically from cannabis plants, right? And so again, the goal is for all these businesses and new industries and really existing industries to grow into and work together to create an entire brand new industry going forward. Distributor license will allow for wholesale distribution, to retailers and other businesses. A cooperative license is a little more involved, where it allows for different aspects of some of these other licenses to come together. And so some of the folks looking to get involved in the industry will be looking at the cooperative licenses. And then micro business is a license where there are going to be certain limitations on how much revenue a business has. So it's really intended for smaller smaller businesses with, certain revenue limitations as to how much they're able to produce. And then we have the retail dispensary, which is going to be the more public facing cafe type retail distribution and on-site as well. And so retail is walk in and walk out. On-site is the cafe type license. And again, those are the ones that are going to be public facing, where anyone can walk in and walk out with cannabis product. And then just the last couple, is delivery and the distribution license. And so the key thing to think about with the licenses is what the application process will be. And the only way to think about it is it's going to be similar to the way alcohol licenses are currently issued to alcohol businesses, which is, there's going to be a full background check, personal information, financial information, fingerprinting, and really, questions that focus on good moral character, right? So this isn't open to folks that have not historically demonstrated as being morally correct, and the criminal aspect will certainly be addressed in the regulations. And so again, this is the framework as we're aware of it today, with April being when the law first was passed. We're probably looking at sometime by next summer before we know what a lot of this really means about how businesses can get involved, and about what the impact will be. But the employment stuff for all of you that have employees that have employment policies, all of that is currently active and needs to be addressed, and really something to focus on today, to make sure that anything that is done and any incidents are addressed properly now within this new framework. So that's all I have for today. I'm happy to answer questions, later, Kevin, whenever you think is appropriate. So,
sure.
I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Arthur. Very informative, very educational for all of us. I mean, we have a lot to learn, and it was actually very helpful for us. Thank you so much for your presentation.